The wind had been screaming across the Montana mountains for nearly 6 hours when Daniel Mercer saw something that didn't belong in the snow. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree. Then he
Miss!
saw a hand. A woman's hand. It
Can
was
you hear
barely
me?
visible beneath the fresh snow, fingers stiff and pale, reaching toward the sky as if she had been trying to pull herself free. Daniel killed the engine of his old pickup and stared through the windshield. For a few seconds, he didn't move. The storm had already buried most of the road. The temperature had dropped far below freezing, and the nearest town was more than 30 miles away. Nobody was supposed to be out here. Daniel grabbed his coat, stepped into the wind, and hurried toward the strange shape. Hey, no answer. He dropped to his knees and began brushing snow away with his bare hands. A face appeared. A young woman's. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were blue. And she was so cold that Daniel couldn't tell whether she was still breathing. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. Nothing. His heart stopped. Then, almost impossibly, he felt the faintest pulse. Come on, he whispered, stay with me. He lifted her carefully and carried her toward the truck. But as he turned, something slipped from beneath her coat and landed in the snow. An old photograph. Daniel picked it up. And the moment he saw the face in that photograph, he froze. Because he knew the man standing beside the woman. And that man had been dead for 19 years. Daniel Mercer had lived alone on his ranch for almost a decade. The ranch sat in a remote valley surrounded by mountains, pine forests, and long stretches of empty land. In summer, the place could feel peaceful. In winter, it felt like another world. Daniel preferred it that way. He had once been the kind of man who filled a room with laughter. He had been married, he had a daughter. He had friends who stopped by without calling. Then one winter morning, everything changed. His wife Emily had died after a sudden illness. 2 years later, his daughter had moved to Oregon and slowly stopped calling. Daniel never blamed her. He simply stopped expecting people to stay. So he repaired fences, fed horses, chopped wood, and spent his evenings beside the fireplace with a cup of coffee. His life was quiet, predictable, safe, until the storm. That night, Daniel had driven into town for supplies. On the way home, he noticed something strange on the side of the mountain road. At first, he thought it was debris. Then he saw the hand. Now the woman was lying across the back seat of his truck, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Daniel kept looking at her through the rearview mirror. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her dark hair was frozen against her face. There were no bags beside her. No phones. No identification. Nothing except that photograph. Daniel drove faster. His ranch was the closest shelter. When he finally reached the cabin, he carried her inside and placed her near the fireplace. He added another log to the fire. Then another. He heated water and prepared warm blankets. For the next hour, he worked quietly. He didn't know her names. He didn't know where she had come from. And he didn't know why she had been buried beneath the snow. But he knew one thing. She had almost died. Slowly, color returned to her face. Then her fingers moved. Daniel leaned closer. Her eyes opened. She looked terrified. You're safe, he said. The woman stared at him. Where am I? My ranch. She tried to sit up. Daniel gently stopped her. Don't move too fast. She looked toward the window. The storm was still raging outside. Then she looked back at him. Did you find me? Oh, yes. She swallowed. Did anyone else see me? Daniel paused. No. For the first time, she seemed to breathe. What's your name? Silence. Her eyes dropped toward the floor. I can't tell you. Daniel didn't press her. He simply placed a cup of warm water beside her. You don't have to tell me anything tonight. She looked at him with surprise. Why are you helping me? Daniel stared at the fire. Because somebody should. The woman lowered her eyes. Neither of them spoke again. But Daniel noticed something. She kept looking at the old photograph sitting on the table. And he knew he had to ask. Where did you get that? The woman's expression changed. She reached for the photograph. Daniel stopped her. That man's. He picked it up. I know him. Her eyes filled with tears. His name was Thomas Mercer. Daniel went completely still. That was his older brother. Thomas had died 19 years earlier. A hunting accident in the mountains. At least that was what Daniel had always been told. How do you know my brothers? The woman looked toward the fires. I came here because of him. Daniel sat down slowly. Why? She held the photograph against her chest. Because he saved my mother's life. Daniel stared at her. The storm continued pounding against the cabin. And suddenly the night felt much longer. Her name was Clara Bennett. She had spent the previous 2 days traveling toward Daniel's ranch. She had come from Idaho after finding a box of letters among her late mother's belongings. Inside that box were photographs, newspaper clippings, and dozens of letters written nearly 20 years earlier. All of them mentioned one name. Thomas Mercer. Clara's mother had been 17 when she became stranded in the mountains during a winter storm. She had been injured and alone. A young man had found her. He had carried her to safety. He had given her food. He had stayed beside her until rescuers arrived. That young man was Thomas. But there was something else. Thomas had never told anyone about it. Not Daniel's. Not his parents. Not even his closest friends. He had simply gone home after the rescue and continued living his life. Years later, Clara's mother had tried to find him. She wanted to thank him, but she couldn't. Thomas had disappeared from her life. Then, shortly before she died, Clara's mother gave her daughter the box. Find his family, she had said. Tell them he was a good man. Clara had promised. She had spent months searching. Eventually, she found Daniel's ranch. But when she arrived in Montana, the storm hit. Her car became stuck. She continued on foot. She thought the ranch was only a few miles away. She had been wrong. The cold had nearly killed her. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked down at the photograph. My brother never told me. I know. How do you know? Clara gave a sad smile. Because your brother wasn't the kind of person who helped people so they would remember him. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Thomas had always been like that. Quiet, reliable. The kind of man who would fix your fence without asking for payment. Daniel had forgotten that. Over the years, he had remembered Thomas mostly through the argument they had before his death. They had fought about the ranch. Daniel had said things he regretted. Thomas had left the house angry. 2 days later, he was gone. Daniel had spent 19 years carrying that guilt. Now a stranger was sitting beside his fire, telling him that his brother had saved someone. And suddenly, Daniel wondered how much of Thomas he had forgotten. The next morning, the storm was worse. Snow covered the windows. The road disappeared completely. The power had already gone out. Daniel checked the generator. There was enough fuel for several days, but not much more. Clara stood beside the window. I should leave. Daniel turned. In this weather, I've already caused enough trouble. You almost died. I know. Then you're staying. She looked at him. Why? Because I said so. For the first time, she smiled. It was small, but it was real. Daniel spent the morning repairing the generator. Clara helped him organize supplies. She wasn't helpless. She knew how to work. She carried wood. She cleaned the kitchen. She even repaired a torn blanket using an old sewing kit. By afternoon, the cabin felt different. It no longer felt like Daniel's empty house. There were 2 cups on the table. 2 plates. 2 voices. Daniel hadn't realized how much he had missed that. That evening, Clara asked him about Thomas. Daniel hesitated. Then he told her everything. The childhood fights. The summer fishing trips. The time Thomas had driven 3 hours through a storm just to help Daniel repair a broken tractor. And finally, the argument before Thomas died. I never apologized, Daniel said. Clara looked at him. Maybe that's why you live alone. Daniel didn't answer. She continued softly. Sometimes people think they're protecting themselves by keeping everyone away. Daniel looked toward the fire. And sometimes they're right. Clara shook her head. No, they're just afraid. The words stayed with him. Because they were true. On the third night, the storm became dangerous. The wind shook the cabin. Snow pushed against the door. The generator began making strange noises. Daniel went outside to inspect it. Clara watched from the window. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She opened the door. Daniel. The wind swallowed her voice. She stepped outside. Daniel appeared through the snow. I'm fine. But when he reached the porch, he stumbled. Clara grabbed his arm. You're freezing. So are you. They helped each other inside. Daniel checked the generator again. It won't last the night. Clara looked at the dark windows. What happens if it stops? We keep the fire going. And if we run out of woods? Daniel didn't answer immediately. We won't. But Clara could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The cabin became colder. They moved closer to the fireplace. Daniel wrapped another blanket around Clara. She noticed his hands trembling. You shouldn't have gone outside. I had to. You always think you have to do everything yourself. Daniel looked at her. Who else would? Clara smiled sadly. Maybe that's the problem. Hours later, Clara finally told Daniel something she had never told anyone. Her mother hadn't simply wanted her daughter to find Thomas's family. She had wanted Clara to understand something. Her mother had spent years believing that one terrible night had ruined her life. But Thomas's kindness had changed everything. Because after he rescued her, she decided to live differently. She finished school. She became a nurse. She raised Clara. She helped strangers. And every year, she donated winter clothing to people living in mountain communities. She said she wanted to keep his kindness moving, Clara whispered. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. She never forgot him. No, Clara pulled a letter from her coat. I was supposed to give this to you. Daniel opened it. The handwriting was old. The letter was short. It thanked Thomas for saving her. Then there was one final sentence. If your brother is anything like you, he probably never believed he did anything special. Daniel couldn't stop the tears. Because that was exactly what Thomas would have said. He had spent 19 years thinking his brother died with their last argument between them. Now he realized something. The last thing Thomas had left behind wasn't anger. It was kindness. Before sunrise, the storm finally began to weaken. The generator stopped. The cabin fell silent. But the fire was still burning. Daniel opened the doors. The world outside was covered in white. The mountains had disappeared beneath the snow. Clara stepped beside him. We made it. Daniel nodded. Oh, yes. She looked at him. What will you do now? Daniel stared across the valley. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't look empty. I think. He paused. I think I might stop waiting for life to knock on my door. Clara smiled. You might have to open it first. Daniel laughed quietly. It was the first real laugh he had heard from himself in years. The road was cleared 2 days later. A rescue truck arrived and took Clara toward town. Before she left, Daniel gave her the photograph. You should keep it. She shook her head. No, she placed it back in his hand. Your brother belongs here. Daniel looked at the picture. Thomas was standing beside Clara's mother, smiling at the camera. For 19 years, Daniel had looked at his brother and remembered loss. Now he saw something else. A man who had quietly changed another person's life. A man who had left behind more kindness than he had ever realized. Clara climbed into the truck. Then she lowered the window. Daniel. He looked up. Thank you. He nodded. Thank your mother. Clara smiled. I will. The truck disappeared down the snowy road. Daniel stood alone outside the cabin. But this time, alone didn't feel the same. 3 months later, spring arrived. The snow melted from the valley. The horses returned to the green fields. And Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the cabin door and waited for someone to arrive. Not because he expected Clara. Not because he expected his daughter. But because he had finally understood what his brother's life had taught him. Sometimes a person can change your life without ever knowing it. Sometimes the kindness you give away travels farther than you ever will. And sometimes the person you think came into your life to be rescued is actually the person who came to rescue you from yourself. Daniel eventually repaired the old guest cabin. He painted the walls, fixed the roof, added a small wood stove. And above the fireplace, he placed Thomas's photograph. Underneath it, he wrote 6 simple words. Kindness should never end with us. Years later, people in the valley would tell stories about Daniel Mercer. They would talk about the rancher who helped stranded travelers during winter. The man who kept blankets in his truck. The man who never turned away someone who needed shelter. And whenever anyone asked him why he did it, Daniel always gave the same answer. He would look toward the mountains. Then he would say, someone once did it for my family. And that was enough. Because on one freezing night, a man had found a woman buried beneath the snow. He thought he was saving her life. He never expected her story to save his. And perhaps that is what makes a hero. Not the person who performs one extraordinary act, but the person who learns from an act of kindness and chooses to pass it on.